Welcome to our patient perspective presentation for Nursing 700. In this PowerPoint, we will explore the perspective and experience of a patient and her sister as they navigate the mental health system in New York. We will then evaluate our patient's story through the model for culturally competent care outlined in an article by Noah Metzger and others. Let's begin. Our story comes from a recent New York Times opinion piece written January 6, 2023, entitled, "I'm the Last Barrier Between My Sister and New York City." The article is a first-person account written from the perspective of the sister of a patient diagnosed with bipolar disorder and later schizoaffective disorder. The writer describes her desperate and unsuccessful attempts to secure outpatient care for her sister under Kendra's law. She is told that she is responsible for housing her sister, or else the hospital will discharge the patient to a homeless shelter. Her experience gives the writer insight into why there are thousands of unhoused mentally ill patients living in the streets of Los Angeles and New York. Before analyzing the article, a word on the law. Kendra's law was passed in New York in 1999 following an incident in which a mentally ill man with a long history of multiple psychiatric hospitalizations killed a woman by pushing her in front of a moving subway. The law allows someone else to file a petition with the court if they feel the person meets AOT criteria. AOT refers to assisted outpatient treatment. Eligibility is based on a determination the patient cannot survive safely in the community without supervision and that the person has a history of noncompliance in at least two areas: being in the hospital or jail at least twice within the last 36 months, and 2, the evidence of violence towards self or others within the last 48 months. California has a counterpart called Laura's Law. So let's apply the 5 aspects of cultural competency proposed by Noah Metzger: patient-provider communication, shared decision-making, experiences leading to trust and distrust, experiences of discrimination, and linguistic competence. First aspect, patient-provider communication. In the DeVry story, the patient has been in and out of New York's treatment facilities. She is not compliant with treatment and her mental health is deteriorating. Listen to how the writer describes patient-provider communication in her encounter with hospital personnel. Quote, "As obvious as her condition is, I am forced to convince the hospital's doctors that she needs mandated outpatient treatment. When my phone calls are not returned and I'm given cursory and conflicting information from the psychiatrist and social worker assigned to my sister's team, I fly to New York from Los Angeles to meet them." End quote. According to the article by Noah Metzger, this is an example of ineffective patient-provider communication. Ultimately, it creates a barrier to care. Now the second aspect of cultural competence, respect for patient preference and shared decision-making. Ideally, healthcare decisions should be shared between patients and their medical providers. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration endorses patient preferences as the relative desirability or acceptability to patients of specified alternatives or choices among outcomes. Ethically, this upholds the principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and especially autonomy to ensure high-quality, patient-centered goals in treatment. But in the DeVry's article, this doesn't happen. The writer describes a one-sided decision-making process in which the professionals call all the shots, despite their patronizing assurance that they are keeping an open mind. What happened? Well, let's consider 4 obstacles to patient preference and shared decision-making, according to criteria set forth in the American Medical Association Journal of Ethics. The first obstacle is the patient's lack of capacity. The patient in our story cannot meaningfully participate in shared decision-making as a result of her mental illness. The second obstacle is the patient's lack of insight. She is unable to comprehend the nature of her medical condition or treatment outcomes. The third obstacle is the therapeutic pessimism and personal dislike. Whether intended or not, the attitudes conveyed by the professionals in this story leave the writer in despair. The last obstacle is the conflicting recovery orientations or goals of care. In this case, the psychiatrist is focused on increasing the dose of the patient's psychotropic medication, but to the writer, perseverating on dosage is a moot point. Whether it's high or low is irrelevant. The patient is not going to comply with anything. And there's the obstacle. The providers are missing the point. The patient needs sustained protection over time. Which then leads us to the third aspect of cultural competence, experiences leading to trust and distrust. According to the No Metzger article, patients have a trusting relationship with their providers, and when they do, they are more likely to follow through on treatment recommendations and less likely to cancel or no-show. Contrast that with the article by DeVries, wherein the writer is on the receiving end of an empathy failure after unsuccessfully seeking help from 3 professionals. First, the writer experiences a disconnect when she tries to explain to the psychiatrist that her sister has a history of noncompliance with medications, and yet his preoccupation with dosages remains. Second, the writer finds herself up against a social worker who is, quote, unmoved, end quote, by the writer's effort to explain that the patient has a knife, a statement that should suggest imminent harm. Third, the writer is blamed and scolded by a nurse for, quote, confusing and not helping the patient, end quote, when in fact, the patient is already confused by virtue of her mental illness, and the writer is the only one helping the patient. The fourth aspect of cultural competency is experiences of discrimination. In the DeVries case, the writer describes 2 areas of discrimination. First, the social worker tells her that her sister does not qualify for outpatient care under Kendra's law. Second, the social worker tells her it's up to the writer to find housing, or else the hospital would discharge the patient to a homeless shelter. Why does this constitute discrimination? Well, discrimination by definition is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of a person on the grounds of ethnicity, age, gender, and also disability. According to the Social Security Administration, mental illness qualifies as a disability. In the DeVries case, the patient is destined to live in the street unless her sister intercedes. What this means is that the patient will die in the street, because the reality is 1/3 of the homeless in the United States has an untreated mental illness. In Los Angeles, those with a history of psychiatric hospitalizations are 3 times more likely to use a garbage can for food. Mentally ill, homeless persons are victimized more often by 74 to 87%, and the homeless mentally ill die faster than the general population by 9%. One woman said it best, "My mother was failed again and again by a system that operates out of the best of intentions, yet leaves the most vulnerable among us to suffer and die in the streets." At first impulse, we may want to jump to the defense of the writer and argue that Kendra's law should be liberalized, but that would be discriminatory too. First, there are legitimate questions about the constitutionality of Kendra's law. It is unconstitutional to deprive competent, non-dangerous persons with psychiatric disabilities of their right to freedom after they have been released from a psychiatric hold. This is in keeping with the earliest federal law on the subject reflected in the U.S. Supreme Court decision in O'Connor v. Donaldson, in which it was determined that a state cannot constitutionally confine a non-dangerous person. Only when a person is established as an imminent danger to self or others can the state deprive a person of liberty, and only to the least extent that protection can be afforded. The final aspect of cultural competency is linguistic competency. According to No Metzger, earlier health outcomes are associated with language concordant encounters. When languages are diverse, these encounters are bolstered by the use of interpreters and the elimination of medical lingo. But the DeVries article goes one step further. It demonstrates that people can speak the same language and still feel unheard. In our DeVries case, the person is incompetent and therefore has no voice, meaning she has little to no insight into her mental illness and therefore cannot speak up for herself nor advocate for herself. Her sister has a voice, but her voice is unheard. The patient is therefore at the center of a discordant encounter, despite speaking the very same language. What the story by Hilary DeVries tells us is we have a problem. Although Kendra's Law was created to overcome treatment obstacles for mentally ill patients who are falling through the cracks, the law is limited in its ability to meet real-life demands. Essentially, people with mental illnesses are still falling through the cracks. What can we do about it? Organizations like Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration provide general information on mental health issues and treatment services. Likewise, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services provide resources like crisis intervention centers for people in need. A final idea comes from the city planner Carrie Morrison of Hollywood, California. It's called the Trieste Pilot Project. It was modeled after an exemplary mental health program in Trieste, Italy. It relies on existing California law, specifically the Landrum and Petrus Short Act of 1967, to support a relentless outreach and engagement, including street psychiatry, access to shelters and homes, intensive follow-up, and psychiatric inpatient and outpatient care. The goal is to help foster the full recovery of the severely mentally ill and to eliminate homelessness, incarcerations, and hospital overuse. Thank you for your time.